The fog lay thick upon the Thames that evening, a pall of shifting grey that blurred the outlines of ships at anchor and muffled the chime of distant bells. London seemed caught between sleep and waking, its lamps glowing faintly through the damp haze like watchful eyes in the dark. It was in such a twilight hour that a telegram reached our rooms at Baker Street, summoning Holmes and myself to the most peculiar of tragedies. A keeper at a lonely coastal beacon had been found lifeless in his locked chamber, a revolver by his side, the tide hammering ceaselessly against the stone below. No witness had seen another approach, no footprint marked the sands, and yet whispers spoke of strange lights flaring across the surf. Even before I had read the final line, Holmes had risen from his chair, the ash from his pipe scattering like spent gunpowder. "Come, Watson," he murmured, his eyes alight with that cold fire which heralded the chase. "The tide waits for no man, and neither does death." Before we follow Holmes into the damp corridors of the Lighthouse and the darker corridors of the human mind, I invite you, our faithful companions on these adventures, to lend your support to this chronicle. If the mysteries of Baker Street stir your imagination, then do take a moment to subscribe, to share these stories with others, and to remain at our side as we trace each shadow and footprint that destiny has left in its wake. For in these gaslit tales, every loyal listener becomes part of the investigation. Now let me set before you the course of our inquiry. The evening was one of those peculiar London nights when the fog drifts like a living thing, curling into every doorway and coiling round every lamppost with the persistence of a thief seeking entry. The lamps of Baker Street threw only the faintest halos upon the pavement below, and the steady clop of a hansome's hooves was dulled into a muffled rhythm that seemed to belong to some dream world rather than to the great throbbing city. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair by the fire, long legs crossed, his piercing eyes fixed not upon me, but upon some unseen horizon of his mind. The blue spiral of tobacco smoke rose lazily from his pipe, mingling with the haze that clung stubbornly to our very window panes. I'd been making some notes upon an old case that might, in time, find their way into the pages of my journals, when the sharp clatter of footsteps outside broke the drowsy quiet of the room. A moment later, there came a brisk rap upon the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a boy in the scarlet uniform of the telegraph service, his cap shining with damp and his cheeks flushed from the chill. He handed over an envelope sealed in blue wax, its edges smudged with salt stains, as though it had traveled some distance in rough weather. Holmes took it with that quick, nervous movement of his long fingers, tore it open, and held the flimsy sheet up to the lamplight. I observed the Von Sharper sudden tightening of his mouth, the gleam that flashed into his grey eyes. He read the message twice, then passed it across to me without a word. "Keeper of Seaforth Light found dead in locked chamber. Circumstances suspicious. Request your immediate presence. Inspector Gryce, Scotland Yard." The words seemed to leap from the paper, stark as a pistol shot in the stillness. "A lighthouse keeper, Holmes," I exclaimed. "Dead in his own tower, and under suspicious circumstances. Why, the very setting sounds like the beginning of one of those dreadful sea yarns sailors tell in taverns." Holmes's smile was a mere tightening of his features. "The sea," he said, "has ever been the accomplice of man, Watson. Sometimes in honest labor, sometimes in crime. A lighthouse is meant to warn, to preserve. Yet I have no doubt this one has become an instrument of something darker. Pack your bag, my dear fellow. The night train will bear us to the coast before dawn, and the tide will not pause for our convenience." I confess I felt a shiver, though whether from the damp air or from the uncanny image his words conjured, I cannot say. The notion of a beacon standing alone upon a storm-lashed headland, its solitary keeper lying lifeless within, struck at some deep chord of unease. I slipped the telegram into my pocket-book, gathered my travelling cloak, and prepared to accompany Holmes into yet another theatre of mystery. The train that bore us out of London rattled and groaned as though reluctant to abandon the warmth of the city for the raw breath of the Channel. Our compartment smelled faintly of coal dust and damp leather, and the fog pressed against the windows like a living curtain. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean frame wrapped in a long grey travelling coat, his sharp features half-shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. For some time he smoked in silence, the glow of his pipe an ember in the gloom, while I watched the shifting shapes of the countryside pass like ghosts beyond the glass. At length I ventured, "You are unusually quiet tonight, Holmes. Does the case present itself already in some definite shape to your mind?" He turned those keen eyes upon me, eyes that seemed to pierce not merely the fog outside, but the very fog of uncertainty itself. "Consider the elements, Watson," he said softly. "A man found dead in a locked chamber within a structure whose very purpose is isolation. If murder, then it is one of ingenuity bordering upon the impossible. If suicide, then why the urgency of a telegram from Scotland Yard? Gryce is not a man to trouble me for trifles. No, there is some element here which has perplexed him, and where Gryce halts, it is my duty to advance." I warmed myself at the thought, for the tone in which he spoke was the very voice of the chase. It was that quality of cold fire, of concentrated energy, which always heralded some remarkable unfolding. The carriage rocked, the lamps swayed, and hours slid by in a rhythm of wheel and whistle. I confess I dozed at intervals, lulled by the monotone of the train, but Holmes remained as rigid as a sentinel, his gaze never straying from the murk beyond the window. We reached the coast at dawn. A pale light seeped through the mist, turning the sea to a shifting plain of lead. The harbour town, huddled against the cliffs, smelled of tar, wet rope and fish, the cries of gulls rising like a lament above the surf. A hired trap conveyed us along a narrow road that wound between dunes, the sound of the breakers growing louder with every turn. Presently, the silhouette of the lighthouse loomed against the dim horizon, its tower thrust like a warning finger into the sky. It stood solitary upon a promontory, the spray leaping white at its base, the great lantern above now extinguished in the day's wan light. Holmes regarded it with the air of a man studying a problem in geometry. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The tower's position, cut off save by that narrow causeway. A man within is as secure as in a fortress, yet also as trapped as in a cell. To die locked within such a chamber is no ordinary fate." We were met by Inspector Gryce, a thick-set man with a bristling moustache, his boots crusted with sand and salt. He shook our hands with a seaman's grip, his manner brisk yet tinged with relief. "Thank heaven you've come, Mr. Holmes. I've seen many a queer business in my time, but this beats the lot. Come and see for yourself." He led us up the spiral stair of the tower, the stone slick with damp, the iron rail cold beneath the hand. Each step echoed like the toll of a bell, and the salt air grew sharper as we ascended. At last we reached the keeper's chamber, a round room set midway up the tower. Its heavy oak door had been forced open, splintered round the lock, for when they had first found it, it had been bolted from within. The air within was close, tinged with oil from the lamps and a faint reek of powder. Upon the narrow bed lay the body of a man, middle-aged, weather-beaten, his face marked with the roughness of one long accustomed to the sea wind. He was dressed in coarse wool, his boots still damp with spray. A revolver lay at his side, one chamber discharged. The expression upon his features was not one of peace, but of startled terror, as though death had taken him unawares. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes darting from the weapon to the walls, from the bed to the narrow window that looked seaward. He bent once to examine a smudge upon the grate, touched it with a finger, and raised it to the light. Then he straightened, his gaze sweeping the room with that hawk-like concentration I had learned to recognize as the herald of revelation. "What do you make of it, Mr. Holmes?" Gryce demanded, his tone a mixture of challenge and appeal. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to the small desk upon which lay the logbook of the Lighthouse. He opened it, scanned a page, and allowed the ghost of a smile to play upon his lips. "The sea tells its story, Inspector," he said at last. "It is merely a matter of listening. The dead man has left us clues enough. The question is, will we heed them before the tide erases all?" I felt the chill of those words sink into my very bones. For in that dim chamber, with the salt spray rattling against the panes and the body lying stiff upon the bed, it seemed as though the sea itself waited hungrily outside, eager to claim not only the dead, but also the truth of how he died. The round chamber had that air of functional austerity which so often attends places where solitude and duty are the sole occupants. The walls were whitewashed, though the sea had etched its breath upon them in a delicate fur of salt. A narrow iron stove crouched by the grate, a table with charts, a brass oil measure, and the log-book stood beneath the little window that gave upon the grey immensity of water and sky. There was no ornament, nothing to catch the eye save the thing that lay upon the cot, the keeper's body, arranged as death had arranged it, with an indifference that felt almost intentional. The revolver at his side lent to the scene that disagreeable suggestion of self-slaughter which, in less experienced hands than Holmes's, might have put an end to inquiry before it had properly begun. Inspector Gryce stood stoutly near the door with his notebook in hand, his moustache thrust forward as if in accusation against the very air. "Name is Colin Merrick," he said. 49, 10 years at Seaforth Light. No wife at the station. His cottage stands half a mile along the cliff road. A reliable man, by all accounts. Door was barred from within when Coast Guard Sergeant Pritchard came at dawn to relieve him for an hour. Routine visit every second morning. Pritchard knocked, got no answer, and when he peered through the window, he saw Merrick lying as you see him. We forced the door. The bar was on. The bar, Holmes repeated and crossed to examine it. It was a heavy oak spar that dropped into iron brackets and could be secured with a simple hasp. He lifted it, weighed it in his hands, and replaced it with a faint click. Then he knelt by the inner face of the door, where splinters from the forced lock lay like pale fish bones. His forefinger traced the torn wood, not idly, but with that minute attention which, with him, was the form patience took. "You broke it in with a ram." A length of driftwood, rounded and stout. No time to fetch a smith. Holmes's eyes travelled upward to the lintel, where the salt had crusted in a faint, crystalline beard. He said nothing, but he drew from his pocket a little lens and turned it upon the iron bracket that took the end of the bar. He breathed lightly upon it. A faint moisture bloomed, and with it a suggestion, the merest shade, of something dark at the seam of metal and wood. He touched it with the tip of his nail, and then held the nail up to the window. "Lampblack," he murmured, half to himself, "or a cousin to it." I confess my own attention had fallen upon the revolver, an ordinary serviceable weapon of the sort any man might keep for signals, or for discouraging curious vagrants who fancied a lighthouse a convenient shelter. One cartridge had been discharged. There was a smudge upon the barrel near the muzzle, and a grey dusting on the boards just beyond. I bent, sniffed, and recoiled at the acrid sting of spent powder. "He fired it quite near to where he lies," I observed. "If the ball took him, but where is the wound?" For, though Merrick's shirt was open at the throat and a dark stain discoloured the wool at the breast, the stain was not so much a single well of gore as a scattered spatter, like rain that has struck a stone. Holmes had already anticipated me. With Gryce's reluctant assistance, he turned the body a little, not roughly, but with that brisk economy a physician or a detective must own. His fingers paused at the sternum, his eyes narrowed. He parted the cloth and found, not the obvious ruin a close-range shot should have made, but a small, irregular tear low to the left of the breastbone, a wound that looked almost like the work of a jagged nail. No blackening, he remarked quietly. "No tattooing of the skin. The revolver does not belong where it lies." Gryce made a sound that might have been a scoff had it not carried a tremor. "Then how did the shot come to be fired, Mr. Holmes? We all heard nothing in the night. The wind was down, the tide ran quiet. If a pistol cracked in this chamber—" "If a pistol cracked," Holmes cut in, "and no one heard it, then we are considering either distance or deceit. Indulge me a moment longer." He went to the little stove and lifted its iron lid. The grate was cold, though a thin lace of ash lay upon the bars. He pinched a trace of it, rubbed it, and held it beneath his nose. "Coal," he said. "Plain hearth coal. But this," and now he crossed to the great brass oil can that sat, sentinel-like, by the wall, "is not plain." He uncorked it and drew in the scent, with one of those long, appreciative inhalations he reserved for a cigar of fine leaf or a chemical of distinctive pedigree. Kerosene of a serviceable grade, yet do you note, Watson, a sweetness in it, a ghost of something floral, not native to the oil itself? I obliged with my own examination and found indeed a faint perfume, elusive, like a memory that will not come at call. Could it be adulterated? Not adulterated, enhanced. He set the can down and wiped the rim with a square of linen he carried for that purpose. We shall come back to that. He moved then with a quickened curiosity about the room, taking in the brass clock on the mantel. Stopped at 8 minutes past 2, the log-book lying open to a hand not quite steady, the little collection of wicks and trimming shears in their tidy drawer. The window, a narrow slit of thick glass, fascinated him longest. He unlatched it, pushed it outward, and listened to the immediate hiss of wet air that rushed in. The sill bore a dusting of fine, pale grit. "Sand," I said. "From the shore?" "From the shore?" "Yes." He touched it, and his fingertip came away with a glistening grain that clung as a mite of mica might cling. He rolled it and regarded me. "And if the window were closed all night, as any prudent keeper would do in such damp, how does beach sand, dry enough to trickle, come to rest upon the inner sill?" He closed the casement and secured the latch with a firm downward press. It seated clean, yet I saw that the iron tongue did not fall snugly into its cup. There was the slightest give, a hair's breadth of play. Inspector Gryce had been pacing, his boots squeaking faintly on the boards. "You speak as if a man came through the window. That is a good 40 feet above the rocks, Mr. Holmes, and there is no gallery at this level, only the lantern platform higher up." "I speak as if the room tells us more than we have yet learned to hear," Holmes replied, and his gaze went to the log-book. He drew it closer to the window and read, not the last line, but the last 4 entries, each neat, each timed, each ending with the keeper's initials, CM. "Midnight. Light steady, wind veering east-southeast. 1:20. Faint gleam reported to the northeast. Possibly fishing smack. 1:40. Eclipse of lens noticed. Cause unascertained. 1:52. Wind drops. Sea quiet. 2:10. Here the hand faltered. The line broke off, and there was a blot where the pen had paused as if at a sudden sound. Holmes's finger rested above those 2 words. Eclipse of lens. In the hush that followed, I became acutely aware of the sea's low breathing at the base of the tower, the insinuating whisper of damp in the stones. "You are thinking of the lantern, Holmes." "I am thinking," said he, "of anything which causes a light meant for truth to speak in falsehood." He shut the book and placed it where it had been. Then, with a suddenness that startled us both, he knelt at the bedside again, not to the body, but to the floor between the bed and the wall. His hand slid into the narrow space, searching, and came forth with a trifling thing that, to my eyes, might have been a crumb of wax. He held it on his palm. "Paraffin," he pronounced. "Colored. See the tint. A yellowed cast, not the clear stuff. A cheap candle, perhaps. But why melt a candle near the floor, and why here?" Gryce shrugged, but uneasily. "We found no candle burnt down in the room." "Of course you did not." Holmes wrapped the crumb in paper and slipped it away. "You found the appearance of a suicide in the convenience of a locked door." He rose with that long, fluid motion of his and looked once more at the revolver, then at the little clock with its arrested hands. 8 minutes past 2. The shot, if it was a shot, must have been near that time. Yet the wound tells of a narrow, violent puncture without the signature of flame. Consider, Watson, a projectile launched without the heraldry of powder or a point driven by cunning hand. I stepped to the window again and looked out upon that sheet of dull metal the sea had become in the wan day. A bolt? A dart? Could some engine discharge such a thing silently within the room? Holmes's eyes glinted. Many things can be made to fly in silence, given elastic, given spring, given weight and leverage. But before we construct weapons in the mind, let us first attend to motive, means, and access. "Inspector, who besides Sergeant Pritchard came to the tower this morning?" "No one. I set a constable at the foot of the stair while I sent for the surgeon and sent the boy with the wire to Baker Street. We touched nothing but the door, the clock, and the revolver." "And the lantern?" Gryce colored. "We went up to see that the light was trimmed for the night, sir. The lens is sound. The mantle was cold when we reached it, as you'd expect." Holmes nodded, not in satisfaction, but in the way a man nods to a fact he has already laid aside. "Very good. Now, Merrick's cottage. We must know what his habits were, whom he feared, whom he loved, what debts he held, and what temptations might have been set before him. But first, I should like to speak with Sergeant Pritchard." Gryce stepped to the door and called down the stair. Presently, heavy boots rang up, and a broad-shouldered fellow in a pea-jacket, with a face the sea had carved into blunt planes, appeared at the threshold and tugged his forelock. "You'll be Mr. Holmes, sir. I found him as he lies." Holmes indicated the logbook. "Sergeant, did Mr. Merrick ever remark to you any difficulty with the light? Any strange eclipses? Any rumors of ships complaining of false bearings?" Pritchard shifted his weight and glanced, almost guiltily, at Gryce. "There's talk in the town, sir, but talk's cheap as spray. Some say they've seen little will-o'-the-wisps upon the water o' nights, lights where there oughtn't to be none. Fisher lads with a dram too many, maybe. As to the lens, well, he did say a week since there was a queer shadow crossed it, but when we looked, there was naught. He was a careful man, was Merrick. Too careful to let the light misspeak." "Too careful," Holmes repeated softly. "And yet he writes of an eclipse, and 8 minutes later, silence." He turned to the stove again, and this time his attention fixed upon the iron back-plate where a faint crescent of soot was of a different hue, as if something had pressed there and drunk the warmth. He laid his palm upon it, then withdrew with a pleased little exclamation. "Ah, you felt something here this morning, Sergeant." Pritchard frowned. "Only that it were warm when we came in, sir, though the stove itself were cold. Thought it queer, but with the shock of the thing." "Warm?" Holmes echoed. "A patch of warmth without a fire to account for it. A weight set there long enough to drink the heat of an engine above and leave its ghost below. Inspector, I will trouble you for a lantern this evening and access to the lantern gallery when dusk falls. Before then, we shall take a turn to Merrick's cottage." Gryce grunted assent, though he wore the look of a man being led from his comfortable assumptions towards a cliff edge. "You'll allow my constable to keep the room as found?" "You will allow nothing else," said Holmes, and the iron in his tone left no room for debate. He closed the window, drew the bar once more to feel its play, and then, as if some inward calculation had satisfied itself, he straightened and took up his coat. "Come, Watson." We descended the spiral, the sea's murmur growing louder, the tang of salt and oil giving way to the raw scent of weed and wet rope. Outside, the day had lifted by a degree, sufficient to show the bleak beauty of that headland, with its rank grass flattened by the wind and the gulls hanging like white scraps torn from a letter no man would ever finish reading. The path to the cottage followed the cliff's rim, and as we walked, Holmes's stride lengthened, the alertness in him rising like a sail catching a new breeze. "You have a theory," I ventured. "I have an attitude," he returned dryly. "Theories are nets, attitudes are knives. We shall need both before we are done." He slowed then and glanced back at the tower. Against the pallid sky, Seaforth light looked less a beacon than an admonition. "Note, Watson, the angle from the lantern to that notch in the rocks below. If a man were to contrive a signal not meant for honest mariners, he would consider sight lines as carefully as a mathematician considers his proofs. And the sweet scent in the oil? A courtesy to the senses, or a signature. When men deal in secret, they thirst for marks known only to the initiated. We shall see." The cottage stood low and square, with a neat garden scraped to its winter bones and a path of cracked shells leading to the door. Holmes paused at the gate and bent, not to the latch, but to a footprint half impressed in the damp earth. It was not the heavy tread of a seafaring boot, but something narrower and more delicate, and at the heel there was an oddness, a double bite, as if a small stone were embedded there. He did not smile. He never did at such times. He merely looked up, and in his eyes I saw that cold fire flame anew. "Not Merrick," he said, "and not Sergeant Pritchard. Someone who visits rarely and treads carefully, yet cannot change the nature of their shoe. Do you hear it, Watson?" "Hear what?" "The sound of a lie that has not yet been told." His hand closed upon the latch and lifted. "It." The door swung inward to a room plain as a monk's cell and twice as orderly, the smell of clean linen and lamp oil meeting us with that curiously domestic hush one encounters only in places where a solitary man has fashioned his own ritual against the encroaching wild. On the table lay a folded paper weighted by a pewter mug. Holmes crossed swiftly and touched the edge of the sheet as a pianist touches the first key of a grave sonata. He read, and a shadow crossed his face. "Watson," he said very gently, "I think the sea has not yet claimed all its secrets. Here is one that washed itself ashore." The path that led from the keeper's cottage sloped gradually down toward the crescent of shingle where the sea threw its voice unceasingly against the land. That morning, the fog had thinned to a gauzy veil, so that the horizon showed itself in sullen bands of steel and pewter, while the gulls wheeled high above like restless scribbles upon a blank sky. Holmes, striding with his coat flaring behind him, seemed attuned not only to the silence of the shore, but to each subtle indentation where the tide and man had wrestled for mastery. I followed close, my boots crunching on damp grit, yet my gaze was constantly drawn to him, for he bent every few paces to study the ground as if deciphering an alphabet written by the elements. "Observe, Watson," he called over his shoulder, his voice steady against the drone of the surf. "The earth is never idle, but it retains the memory of every trespass, if one knows how to compel it to speak. Here, look closely." I stooped beside him where the sand grew firmer, marked by a confusion of lines and hollows. To my eyes it seemed no more than the careless scatter of wind and water. Yet Holmes's finger singled out a depression scarcely deeper than a coin's breadth. "The width is narrow," he murmured. "The heel is faint, but note the angle. It turns ever so slightly inward. And here again, 3 paces farther, precisely the same inclination." "A woman's step?" I suggested, recalling the delicate impression by the cottage gate. "Possibly. Or a man wearing lighter shoes than the fishermen hereabouts. What matters most is not the weight, but the consistency. Regularity of stride is the mark of deliberation. Whoever trod here came with purpose, not as a loiterer." The line of prints descended toward the margin where the tide had recently withdrawn. There, the impressions faltered, blurred by foam, then vanished altogether into the flat shimmer of wet sand. Holmes stood, his face dark against the pale gleam of the sea. "See how fortune toys with us, Watson. The tide is both archivist and censor. It records, then erases. I could not help but feel the futility of that vanishing trail. And yet, I said, you glean from it more than I could hope to from a library shelf. Still, if the ocean has obliterated the remainder, what conclusion can be drawn? He answered not immediately, but stooped to gather a pinch of damp sand between his fingers. He rolled it, scrutinized it, and then raised it to his nose with the fastidiousness of a chemist. Salt, quartz, mica. Nothing unusual. Yet do you note, Watson, a faint black grit mingled with it? Smell. I obeyed and caught the acrid tang of something burnt, faint but undeniable, as though the sea had coughed up a ghost of fire. Ash, Holmes said, but not drift ash from the hearth of a fisherman's hut. This has the bite of coal tar, the residue of an oil-soaked wick. It clings too closely to have drifted idly upon the tide. It was scattered here, deliberately. As he spoke, he pointed to where a darker stain marked the pebbles near a cluster of weed. It looked like nothing more than a patch of moisture, but when Holmes touched it with the tip of his handkerchief, the fabric bore a smudge that glistened faintly in the gray light. Oil, he pronounced, and close by the footprints, no less. Imagine, Watson, a lantern carried not to preserve life, but to pervert it. A false light kindled on the shore. It would explain those rumors in the taverns, those whispers of phantom beacons leading ships astray. The thought struck me with sudden clarity. Then Merrick discovered the trick, and for his knowledge paid with his life. Holmes's face betrayed neither agreement nor denial, only that contained energy which was his substitute for emotion. It is a possibility, but let us not gallop to the end of the road before we have seen each milestone. Note also that the trail leads toward yonder rocks. We made our way to a jagged outcrop where the surf boiled white, the stones glistening like the backs of sea beasts. There, on the sheltered side, I saw with astonishment the remains of a fire. A circle of charred driftwood, half smothered by sand, and within it the stubs of candles sunk deep into the ash. Some had burned down entirely, their wax dribbled into grotesque stalactites. Others lay broken, as if stamped out in haste. Holmes knelt, gathering fragments with infinite care. One he held up between thumb and forefinger, and I saw that its base was coated in that same yellowish paraffin he had found near Merrick's bed. The same signature, he said quietly. This little coterie has a fondness for cheap-colored wax. It is their fingerprint upon the dark. A sound startled me. The harsh cry of a gull disturbed from its perch. It wheeled above us, its wings casting momentary shadows upon the rocks. Yet I confess my heart quickened as though the bird had been some spy crying warning to its unseen masters. The loneliness of that place, the thought of men conspiring under cover of the sea's voice, lent to every echo a sinister import. Holmes seemed unaffected. He moved methodically about the circle, measuring distances with his gaze, noting the way the stones shielded the fire from view of the lighthouse above. Here they could gather unseen, kindle their treacherous flame, and vanish before dawn. The tide would wash their traces clean, save for the few crumbs that fortune left us. I could not suppress a shudder. And Merrick, perhaps he stumbled upon them here. Perhaps he confronted them. Holmes brushed the ash from his hands. Perhaps. But conjecture must wait upon proof. Come, Watson, the air here is heavy with yesterday's crime. Let us return before the tide claims what little remains. We retraced our steps, yet Holmes paused once more where the prints had first begun. He crouched, his hand hovering above the sand, then plucked something so small I might never have noticed it. It was a fragment of cloth, scarcely larger than a shilling, its fibers coarse and stiff with salt. He held it to the light. Canvas. Sailcloth, perhaps. Torn from a garment or a bag. I shall examine it later with a lens. For now, let us consider it one more whisper in the chorus that speaks against chance. We left the beach, climbing back toward the cliff path, and I felt the eyes of the lighthouse upon us, stern and silent, as though it resented our intrusion into its vigil. The wind had freshened, carrying with it the mingled scents of kelp and distant smoke. Holmes walked swiftly, his head bent, his long fingers drumming against his coat as though keeping time with thoughts too rapid for speech. At length he broke the silence. "You see, Watson, how the littlest grains, ash, wax, cloth, compose the architecture of truth. The murder of Merrick, if murder it proves to be, was not the isolated stroke of passion, but the expression of a larger design. He was entangled in a network whose threads run from this bleak strand out into the commerce of the sea, and I do not think we have yet grasped the scale of that web." His words left me uneasy, for they hinted at currents deeper than the mere quarrels of men. The sea stretched out beside us, vast and inscrutable, and I could not help but feel that in its restless depths lay secrets of which our human tragedies were but fleeting ripples. As we neared the cottage once more, Inspector Gryce awaited us, his stocky form outlined against the paling fog. His manner was impatient, as though he mistrusted the profit of our wandering. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he demanded, "have you found what the sand could teach you?" Holmes's smile was faint and unreadable. "Only that the sea does not always speak in its own voice. Sometimes men borrow it, and what they say is falsehood. Come, Inspector, the widow must be waiting, and her words may prove less perishable than footprints on a tide-washed beach." And so we turned inland, leaving behind the murmuring surf and the circle of ash that the next tide would scatter to oblivion, while before us lay the human face of the tragedy, veiled in grief and perhaps in fear. The cottage of Colin Merrick's widow stood where the cliff road dipped into a sheltered hollow, protected from the worst of the sea's fury by a rise of heather-grown earth. It was a modest dwelling of stone and timber, its thatched roof dulled by years of salt wind, its little garden bordered with weather-bleached shells. A faint trail of smoke issued from the chimney, wavering like a reluctant sigh against the graying sky. As we approached, I felt that particular unease which attends an intrusion upon grief. The physician in me knew the rawness of such hours, and yet the detective's calling required us to trespass upon them nonetheless. Inspector Gryce rapped firmly upon the door, and after a moment it was opened by a woman of middle years, her face pale and pinched, but her bearing composed. She wore black already, as if she had prepared for this very summons long before fate demanded it. Her eyes, clear but reddened, took us in with a quiet strength. "You are Mr. Holmes," she said softly, without question. Holmes inclined his head. "And this is Dr. Watson. We are deeply sorry for your loss, Mrs. Merrick. May we come in?" She stepped aside, and we entered a room of simple neatness. The scent of lavender clung faintly to the air, battling the omnipresent tang of salt. Upon the mantel stood a single-framed likeness of her husband in his keeper's coat, a stern face with lines carved deep by wind and duty. The hearth was swept, the table laid with neither extravagance nor neglect. Everything spoke of order and restraint. "I know why you have come," she said once we were seated. Her voice was even, though the hands that clasped and unclasped her apron betrayed a nervous current beneath. "They say my Colin took his own life, but I do not believe it. He was a man of habit, a man who carried his burdens silently but never let them crush him. He would not leave me so." "Your conviction does you credit," Holmes replied gently. "It is precisely to test such appearances that we are here. Did your husband confide in you any fear of late? Any unease in his work at the Light?" She hesitated, then shook her head. Colin was not one to speak much of his duties. Yet he was restless these past weeks. He would rise in the night, go out to the headland, and return with a look upon his face I scarce knew how to read. Once I asked him what troubled him, and he only said, "The sea is not what it seems, Mary. It hides more than it shows." That was all. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "Did he mention strange lights?" At that, her eyes widened. "Yes. He said once that he had seen a glimmer where no ship should be, a beckoning flame that danced and then was gone. He muttered that fools would wreck themselves upon it if it continued. I told him it was no concern of his, but he only shook his head and said, "If the light misleads, Mary, then I'm not a keeper, but a Judas." I begged him to rest, but he carried his duty like a cross. The room was silent, save for the faint hiss of the fire. Could not but feel the ache of her words, the image of a lonely man burdened with knowledge too heavy for one pair of shoulders. Holmes regarded her keenly, though his tone remained measured. "Was your husband in want of money? Any debts, any pressures from without?" She straightened, as if affronted. "Colin was an honest man, Mr. Holmes. We lived simply, but we wanted for nothing. He had his wages from the board, and what little we saved went to keeping the roof sound and the lamp in oil. If there were debts, he never told me." Gryce shifted impatiently in his chair. "And yet a revolver lay at his side, madam. You know how it must appear." Her face paled, but her voice did not waver. "The revolver was kept in the drawer by the logbook. Colin said it was for signals only. Should the light fail or a ship need warning, he would never turn it upon himself." Holmes rose and walked slowly about the room, his eyes taking in each detail, the boots neatly lined by the door, the folded shawl upon the chair, the little shelf of worn volumes, maritime almanacs, a Bible, a collection of ballads. He paused at the mantel, studying the likeness of Merrick. Then he turned to the widow once more. "Forgive me for pressing you, Mrs. Merrick, but on the night before his death, did he receive any visitor? Any message?" She drew in a breath, her composure faltering. "There was a knock at the door, just after dusk. I was in the kitchen. When I came out, Colin was already outside speaking to someone. I could not see the face, only the shadow against the hedge. When he returned, he was troubled, more so than I'd ever seen him. He would not tell me what was said. He only sat long at the table, staring into the fire. Later, he went back to the tower." Holmes's eyes glimmered with that spark of satisfaction which betrayed the discovery of a new thread. "And you did not recognize the voice?" She shook her head. Low, quick, as if afraid of being overheard. "That is all I can recall." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "You have been of great help, madam. Your husband's honor may yet be vindicated. If you permit, I shall return should further questions arise." She clasped her hands tightly. "Find the truth, Mr. Holmes. That is all I ask. Find it, and let the world know he did not die by his own hand." We took our leave, the sea wind catching at the door as it closed behind us. Holmes walked in silence for some distance, his face set, his stride swift. I ventured at last. "You believe her, Holmes?" "I believe grief speaks truer than appearances, Watson. The widow's testimony corroborates what we found upon the shore. Merrick saw false lights, and he saw them often enough to disturb his peace. He met with one who sought either to warn or to tempt him, and that interview weighed upon him heavily. Within hours, he was dead. Do you call that coincidence?" "No," I admitted. "It bears the stamp of design." Holmes's gaze swept the grey horizon where the tower rose stark and solitary. "Design, yes. And where design exists, there is intent. We must next discern whose intent it was, and to what end. But first, Watson, we shall pay a call upon the taverns of Seaforth. For where the sea and men meet over ale, rumour runs faster than truth, and sometimes nearer to it." Thus we turned our steps toward the clustered roofs of the little town, leaving behind the widow's cottage, where grief had been dressed in dignity but could not wholly mask the shadows of fear. The sea muttered at our backs like a witness still unwilling to speak, while before us lay the voices of sailors and villagers, loud with rumour and heavy with ale. The town of Seaforth lay huddled close against the harbour, as though it sought both refuge from and access to the sea that sustained it. The streets were narrow, paved in cobbles glistening with mist, and the houses leaned upon one another with the weary intimacy of old companions weathering many storms. Nets hung drying between beams, their damp cords dripping like tresses, and the air was a mingling of tar, smoke, and salt that clung to the very throat. We followed Inspector Gryce along the quay, where a line of fishing smacks pitched gently at anchor, their masts creaking like restless sleepers. Beyond them, the fog still loitered in ragged banks, drifting in from the grey expanse of the channel. Our destination was a tavern whose signboard, depicting a weather-beaten mariner raising a lantern, swung with a mournful squeal above the door. The Seafarer's Rest was one of those establishments where rumour flows as freely as ale, and where the smoke of pipes weaves a thicker curtain than the sea fog without. The room within was dim, crowded with men whose faces bore the stamp of hard labour and harder drink. Their voices rose and fell like the tide itself, now a roar, now a murmur. As Holmes and I entered, conversation faltered for a heartbeat, then resumed with a guarded hum. Men stared at us from beneath bristling brows, and I was reminded that strangers are not always welcome in ports where secrets are as common as fish. Inspector Gryce's presence, however, seemed to lend us a grudging license, and soon we found ourselves seated near the fire with a pair of tankards before us. Holmes, though he scarcely touched his drink, appeared entirely at ease, his gaze wandering idly over the company, while his ears drank in every syllable. It was not long before the talk, though cloaked in casual tones, bent toward the matter that had brought us here. At a nearby table, a sailor with a scarred cheek leaned toward his companions. "Mark me, it weren't no suicide. Colin Merrick knew too much. He'd seen the ghost lights on the water, same as I. Strange flares, here one minute, gone the next. Luring poor fools onto the rocks they are." Another man snorted, his laugh harsh as the scrape of rope. "Ghost lights, you say? Smugglers' lamps, more like. I've seen them too, aye, and I know the pattern. One on the headland, one low by the tide. Set together, they trick a ship into thinking the channel lies yonder, when in truth it leads straight to ruin. A clever game, and a deadly one." Holmes leaned slightly toward me, his lips curving in the faintest smile. "Do you hear, Watson? The voices of the Strand speak the very language we glimpsed in the ashes upon the rocks, a false constellation arranged by human hands." A third voice, rougher and lower, joined the discourse. An old mariner, his beard yellowed by tobacco, shook his head with a grimness born of long memory. "Clever or cursed, call it what you will. I say the light itself is haunted. Haven't we heard the tales? A keeper vanished 30 years past, gone without a trace, his boots still by the bed. They say his spirit walks the tower still, showing false beacons to any ship that passes. Colin Merrick crossed him, that's the truth of it. You'll not find justice where ghosts are concerned." The laughter that followed was uneasy, for though men jest at spirits, none are wholly free of dread when the sea is involved. Holmes's eyes glimmered, but he did not rebuke the superstition. Instead, he allowed it to hang in the air like a veil, behind which the harder edges of truth might more easily be discerned. Inspector Gryce, less patient, rapped his tankard upon the table. "You'll do well to keep your tales to yourselves, lads. The yard wants facts, not fancies. If you know of smuggling, best speak plain, else you'll find the law less forgiving when it comes calling." A murmur rose, resentful, suspicious. Yet one man, a gaunt fellow with a sailor's gait and eyes sunk deep as harbour pools, leaned forward. "There's been wrecks, Inspector. Not many folk will speak of them for fear of drawing blame, but I'll tell you this. Ships have come ashore these past months where no storm should have driven them. Cargo lost, men drowned, and always the whisper of a light that misled. Some folk profit by it, though none will name who. But Merrick, aye, he was asking questions. Too many questions. If you ask me, the sea didn't take him. Men did. Holmes's voice entered the hush that followed, quiet yet compelling. "And these men, have you seen them?" The sailor's gaze flicked toward him, wary. "No faces, sir. Only shadows on the cliff, and once I thought I heard oars at midnight where no boat should be. But speak of it too loud, and you'll find trouble on your own doorstep. Best leave it to the sea. Say most." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "The sea is vast, but its accomplices are human. I thank you for your candor." The conversation around us resumed, though always with that undercurrent of unease. The rumors were like driftwood, some heavy with substance, others hollow and waterlogged, yet all carried by the same tide. Holmes sat back, his long fingers drumming lightly against his knee, his eyes far away. When at last we left the tavern, the air outside seemed almost pure by contrast, though it carried the odor of fish and tar. The lamps along the quay glimmered in the mist, reflected in trembling fragments upon the water. Holmes paused, drawing his coat close, and looked toward the dark line of the headland where the lighthouse rose. "Do you mark the pattern, Watson?" he asked softly. Smugglers' lamps, false signals, ships misled. Merrick saw too much. He may have stood between wreckers and their profit. And in such commerce, the price of silence is often a man's life. "And yet," I ventured, "rumor alone proves nothing. Could it not still be suicide, colored by imagination?" Holmes turned to me, his expression grave but not unkind. "You are right to remind me of the precipice between conjecture and fact. But the sand, the ash, the widow's testimony, the sailor's whispers, they converge, Watson. They sing one refrain, though each voice differs. The truth lies somewhere among them, waiting to be drawn forth." Inspector Gryce, who had followed us, gave a grunt. "You'll not take tavern talk to court, Mr. Holmes. I still say the simplest answer's the right one. Merrick despaired and ended it. All else is fancy." Holmes merely smiled, that faint smile that never warmed but often cut. "Simplicity, Inspector, is a virtue when it rests upon bedrock, but when it floats upon sand, it is merely a mirage. Come, our next step must be to confront your fellow from the yard. I believe Lestrade has joined us by now." Thus, with the tide whispering at our heels and the rumors of the Strand echoing in our ears, we turned once more toward the inn where Lestrade awaited, bringing with him the skepticism of officialdom and the inevitable clash between Holmes's quiet certainty and the law's demand for the plain and the provable. We found Inspector Lestrade at the Harbour Inn, a narrow-fronted house with bow windows that looked upon the quay and curtains yellowed by years of pipe smoke. He occupied a corner table with his back to the wall and a pot of strong tea at his elbow, his neat figure as compact and self-contained as ever. Though the salt air had pinked his cheeks, his expression retained that air of official skepticism which no weather could blanch. At our entrance, he sprang up, shook Holmes's hand with brisk cordiality, and favored me with a nod that blended politeness and impatience in equal parts. "So here you are at last, Mr. Holmes," he said, seating us and dismissing a hovering landlord with a glance. "I should tell you at once that the facts of this deplorable affair point, in my judgment, in a single direction. The door was barred within, the revolver lay at the deceased's hand, and there is no sign of another having entered. The surgeon declares a wound to the chest, small but mortal. It is the commonest of tragedies. A solitary man at a lonely post, overborne by melancholy." Holmes accepted a cup and regarded the rising steam as if it spelled characters visible only to him. "Common tragedies do not commonly summon me from Baker Street, Lestrade, nor do they smear lamp-black upon door-iron, seed paraffin crumbs under a bed, or perfume their lamp oil with a scent more at home in a milliner's shop than in a lightkeeper's store." Lestrade's brows climbed a line. "Perfume is it? You amaze me, sir. For my part, I prefer blood and bullets to a tar of roses." "Blood and bullets are at hand," Holmes returned mildly. "It is their arrangement I question. You will oblige me, Lestrade, by coming up to the tower at dusk. I fancy the lantern will answer a few of your doubts more eloquently than I could." He consented with a little flourish of his hand that implied he humored us all, and we spent the remainder of the afternoon in a tour of such particulars as even Lestrade must note. The bar that admitted a sliver of play, the window whose latch seated but did not bite clean, the stopped clock, the log's broken line at 10 minutes past 2. He listened, he measured, he peered with his short-sighted frown, and when at last we ascended to the lantern room, the sea lay like beaten pewter to every point of the compass, and the first weak stars trembled in the east. The lantern room was a cathedral of glass and brass, prisms upon prisms, facets banded in gleaming frame, the great lens standing like a frozen wave ready to turn fire into geometry. The air held that faint odor of hot metal and old oil peculiar to such chambers. Holmes moved among the gear with the reverence of a virtuoso examining a Stradivarius. He laid a hand upon the carriage that bore the revolving apparatus, tested the governor, and crouched to inspect the service platform that encircled the lamp's pedestal. "Here," he murmured, and the word drew us to him. At the inner rail, where one might kneel to tend the lamp, a shallow groove marred the otherwise immaculate brass, a groove freshly cut, for its edges were bright and unoxidized. From that groove, a cord, a mere shoelace's thickness, could have run to the back plate of the lantern's housing, where a tiny screw showed the faintest smear of dark grease. Holmes's fingers traced an invisible path from groove to screw, down to the service deck, and thence to a blind corner where someone had fixed a sliver of blackened tin no larger than a playing card. Set upon a pivot and sprung with a strip of whalebone or tempered cane, that sliver could be made to flick out and mask the light's beam for the space of a heartbeat before snapping back. "An eclipse of the lens," Holmes said softly, "but not born of cloud or flaw, born of a hand." Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh that died in his throat as Holmes thumbed the little spring. The tin flicked, the beam faltered, and for a breath the sea beyond fell an immeasurable shade, darker. He flicked it again. The beam blinked, once, twice, then steadied in its monotonous sweep. "Good Lord," I breathed. "A signal." "A code," said Holmes. "By such trifles the truth is perverted, and the coast made traitor to its own. A clever fellow might, with a series of eclipses at appointed intervals, talk to a Confederate boat as plainly as a telegraph speaks along a wire. And if the code were agreed upon, port is safe, bear to starboard, run for the notch. Why, a ship could be lured yards from salvation without a soul, knowing save those who profited by her bones. Merrick recorded an eclipse at 1:40. He may have suspected such trickery. 8 minutes later, he was silenced. Lestrade, to his credit, did not bluster. He bent, he peered, he tested the spring with an official forefinger as though it might bite. Who in the devil's name would dare meddle with the board's light? "Men whose accounts are kept in wreckage rather than ledgers," Holmes replied. "The law calls them wreckers, the polite call them salvage men. I call them murderers when their hands reach the lantern." The last of the daylight drained from the west, leaving the horizon a dull bruise. Holmes trimmed the lamp with the assurance of one who has tended 100 such, and set it burning until the room swam in refracted brilliance. The beam took its long, measured course, stroking the vapor like a great clock's hand marking out dread. "Now we shall watch," he said, and drew us to the lee of the glass, where we might look upon the headland's darker teeth and the black water between. Below us, the causeway lay like a strap of shadow. Beyond, the rocks showed their wet backs to the rhythmic wash. For long minutes nothing stirred save the eternal processions of light and wave. The town behind us dwindled to a sprinkle of lamps. Somewhere inland a dog barked, distant as a memory. Then, so slight I should have missed it had Holmes not stiffened, a prick of light winked from the notch in the rocks to the northeast, no higher than a man's shoulder, and pale as a star behind fog. It burned, faded, burned again in a slow pulse. Holmes's hand closed like a clamp upon the little spring at our feet. The lantern's beam answered with 2 brief eclipses, and a longer third, scarcely perceptible unless one watched for it. Out at the notch, the answering point faltered and ceased, as though surprised. A darker blot detached itself from the greater darkness, no more than a boat's shadow easing back under the cliff. Lestrade's breath hissed. "By heaven, you are right. There they are, bold as you please." "Bold, but cautious," Holmes murmured. "They saw our reply and mistrusted it. They will test the light again before they commit. We shall oblige them." He loosed the spring once, a single blink, short and sharp. At the notch, the faint spark flickered twice in quick succession, paused, and then showed, steady for 3 heartbeats, as one might hold a lantern high above the head and then lower it. Holmes did not answer. He let the true beam sweep on, pitiless and even. The little spark snuffed and did not return. "They have smelt an irregularity," he said. "We have frightened them for this night, but we possess what we lacked this morning, a method and a rendezvous. If there is a rendezvous, there is a master." Lestrade's eyes gleamed. "We'll bring up men from the Coast Guard, set them under the cliff, and have these villains by the collar ere midnight." Holmes shook his head. "You will net shadows. The crew we saw is but a feeler sent out from a safe distance. The brain sits farther back, where oars drip without sound and profits are counted. To catch the arm is something, but to break the hand that guides is better." Lestrade's mouth set. "And you propose?" "To set a pattern that invites a bolder move," Holmes answered. "We shall advertise tonight that the light was troubled by a mechanical fault. No human hand implicated. We shall be observed and believed, for rumor here travels on the wings of gulls. Tomorrow the villains will be emboldened to try again, perhaps in fuller force, trusting that officialdom nods. Meanwhile, you will place your men not under the obvious rocks, but along the back path to the Widow's Hollow, and upon the turf above the notch, where a watcher might stand with a shutter to answer the sea." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "It is a long cordon for a small town." "It is a narrow net for a very large fish," Holmes said, and there was that in his tone which brooked no parley. We remained until the lamp's great eye had made a dozen revolutions, and the tide, turning, began to gurgle hungrily among the stones. Twice more, a timid gleam teased the notch and vanished. Twice more, Holmes denied it answer. At last he extinguished the spring device and, with the same care he had used to expose it, removed the pivoted tin and slipped it into his pocket. "Evidence," he observed, when Lestrade looked askance. "If the Board of Trade does not yet possess a category for this abomination, we shall supply one." On the stair the chill struck us like a wet cloth. The tower's stones sweated, and our footfalls boomed in the hollow shaft. At the base, the wind carried the murmur of the inn and the far-off scrape of a boat's keel upon shingle. Holmes paused at the door and tilted his head, listening as a hound listens at a covert. Then he stepped out into the night, and the mist closed around us with a clammy intimacy. We had gone but a dozen yards along the causeway when a figure detached itself from the deeper dark at the path's bend and came toward us with that quick, compact stride I should have known in any weather. Sergeant Pritchard lifted a hand to his cap. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen. Message from town. A warehouseman down by the fish market says there's been a new crate stowed behind the tar sheds with no ship to its name. Markings foreign, he thinks, and," here his voice dropped, "Mrs. Merrick sent word by a neighbor that a man loitered near her gate at dusk. When she stepped out, he was gone." Holmes's eyes kindled. 2 lines converging, one ashore, one at sea. "The web tightens, Lestrade. See that the crate is watched but not seized. Let the spider show himself." "And the widow?" I asked. "She is under my particular care," Holmes said so quietly that it needed no force. "We will place a constable within sight of her door, but not upon it. A frightened bird will not alight where uniforms gleam." Lestrade pulled up his collar against the wet. You stake much upon their boldness. Villainy that has profited grows tardily cautious, Holmes replied. But profit starved for a night grows rash. Tomorrow's tide is a springtide, Watson. It lifts more than boats. We parted from Lestrade at the inn door, with arrangements laid as neatly as cards before a conjurer. Holmes and I stood a moment under the eaves while the rain began, a fine, insinuating drizzle that silvered the lamplight and turned the key to a mirror. In that wavering glass, the lighthouse's beam walked to and fro, like a sentinel counting the hours. "Do you think they will come?" I asked. Holmes's face was a pale oval in the gloom, his eyes remote. "I think," he said, "that we have touched the hem of a greater garment. Tonight they tested the light. Tomorrow they may test the town. Somewhere beyond that notch a hand grows impatient. I should greatly like to shake it." A cart rattled by, the horse's breath steaming, the driver's hat pulled low. Far out, a bellboy tolled with the sadness of a single thought. Holmes drew me from the rain, but even within, as we took what rest we could, I felt the sea at the door like an uninvited guest, and behind it the intention of men whose commerce taught them to value wreck more dearly than rescue. The dawn that followed was of a pallid sort, a thin light that seemed reluctant to lift the veil of mist from sea and shore. The gulls cried restlessly above the harbor, as though echoing some disquiet that neither wind nor tide could still. Holmes had been wakeful all night, pacing the narrow confines of our lodging at the harbor inn, pausing at the window to watch the faint loom of the lighthouse beam, then returning to his chair where his long fingers tapped incessantly upon the arm as though marking the rhythm of thoughts too swift for words. I, for my part, had found uneasy rest, troubled by dreams of ghostly ships looming out of fog only to shatter upon hidden rocks while silent watchers laughed from the shore. At breakfast, Lestrade arrived, his manner brisk yet edged with fatigue. He had spent the night overseeing his cordon and had little cheer to report. "Nothing stirred by the widow's cottage," he said shortly. "The tar sheds showed only honest fish barrels by the morning, though the crate remains where it was. No hand came to claim it." Holmes stirred his tea with an air of abstraction. "No hand you observed, Lestrade, but hands may move in darkness and leave no shadow at dawn. Did you mark the crate's markings? Foreign characters. Greek, perhaps, or some such scrawl. None here can make sense of it." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "Then we must assume it traveled farther than France. Smuggling, yes, but smuggling with a wider compass. A single wreck may yield brandy or silk. A series, repeated and controlled, yields contraband in volumes worth the risk of hanging. This is not the commerce of a fisherman's band, Lestrade. This is enterprise, and enterprise demands a master." He rose suddenly, his restlessness breaking the thin shell of composure. "Come, Watson. The tide is still low. Let us walk the strand once more before the sea reclaims the night's footprints." We descended together toward the headland. The mist thinned as the sun, wan and reluctant, made a pale shield of the eastern sky. Upon the sand we found not the bold imprints of smugglers' boots, but the faint, hesitant traces of a single figure who had approached from the town and lingered near the rocks. Holmes bent often, his coat flaring with each movement, while I scanned the grey water for any sign of sails. At last he straightened, holding in his hand a length of twine, rough and tarred, ending in a knot unfamiliar to me. "Sailor's craft," he remarked, "but not of the common English rig. This knot is Mediterranean. I have seen its like upon a Greek coaster in Piraeus. Do you not perceive, Watson, how the horizon broadens? Last night we saw shadows in a boat, but the hand that guides them may sit leagues away. These men are the fingers of a body that stretches beyond our channel." We walked on, and soon the tide drove us back toward the quay. There, near the sheds, the crate still rested, its boards stenciled with indecipherable marks. A constable stood guard, stamping his feet against the chill. Holmes examined the crate's seams, inhaled the faint resinous scent that clung to the wood, and tapped the planks with his knuckles. "Pine," he said, "but not cut from our forests. This has the dryness of southern air. If we open it, Lestrade, we risk alarming those who placed it. Better to watch. Yet I will tell you what it holds. Not mere brandy nor lace, but something of weight and value to those who work by night. Ammunition, perhaps, or instruments contrived for signaling. We shall learn soon enough when its owner grows impatient." Lestrade frowned, clearly chafing at Holmes's refusal to seize the prize, but Holmes was already striding away, his eyes fixed on the horizon. That evening the mist thickened once more, muffling the town in a grey cocoon. Lights glimmered faintly behind drawn curtains, and the sea sang its endless hymn against the rocks. Holmes led us to the lantern room again, where we watched with that strained expectancy that makes every shadow suspect. Hours passed, the tide rose, the beam swept its unwearied course. Then, near midnight, a faint glow flickered far to the east, beyond the notch of rocks. Holmes's face sharpened. "Not the fisherman's village," he murmured. "This lies farther, beyond the headland. There is another signal at work." Through the glass, we saw it clearly, a wavering lantern upon the water, moving in deliberate arcs. It rose, fell, vanished, then reappeared, as though answering some unheard call. Holmes's hand moved to the little spring device, but he did not press it. Instead he watched, his eyes narrowing. "They are not speaking to us," he said at last. "They speak to a partner beyond the horizon. A ship lies out there, Watson, beyond the reach of the eye, waiting upon these false lights. What if Merrick discovered not only the trick of the lantern, but the wider commerce it served? His silence would have been imperative." The beam swept on, indifferent, but in my mind's eye I saw a vessel out upon the dark swell, her crew straining at every signal, her fate tethered not to Providence, but to the whim of men ashore. A chill ran through me that was not born of the night air. We descended at length, our thoughts heavy. In the inn parlour below, where the fire burned low, Holmes sat long without speaking, his gaze fixed upon the map of the channel spread upon the table. He marked the headlands with a pencil, drew faint lines between them, then tapped upon a point midway across. "There," he said quietly. "There lies a rendezvous. If one were to steer by false signals here, one would find oneself drawn straight upon that shoal. And if a welcoming boat awaited, what cargo might not change hands unseen? Merrick, by some unhappy chance, pierced the veil. He may even have threatened to expose it, and so—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the weight of it pressed heavily upon us all. Lestrade cleared his throat. "If you are right, Holmes, this is no small business. Smuggling's one thing, wrecking another, but this smacks of treason, of foreign agents making our coast their channel." Holmes looked up, and for a moment the firelight struck his face into sharp relief, showing every line of thought, every flicker of resolve. "It smacks, Lestrade, of enterprise that values neither life nor nation, only profit. Whether the coin be English or foreign, the sea is their marketplace. Merrick became an obstacle. Obstacles are removed." The clock upon the mantel struck 1. Holmes folded the map, slipped it into his pocket, and rose. "We have glimpsed the shadow, Watson. Tomorrow we must grasp the hand that casts it." The following evening fell with a sullen heaviness, as though the sea itself conspired to conceal the truth beneath its shifting veil. A drizzle had set in, fine as breath upon glass, and the streets of Seaforth gleamed with a dim sheen beneath the oil lamps. Holmes, silent as ever when the moment for action approached, led us once more toward the tower. The beam already swept its solemn arc across the fog-laden waters, a vast eye opening and closing in patient rhythm. Inside the lantern chamber, the machinery ticked and hummed with an almost monastic solemnity. The prisms caught the flame's heart and spun it outward, casting a trembling radiance upon the mist. Lestrade stood with arms folded, skepticism and curiosity warring upon his face. Gryce had joined us as well, his heavy boots echoing on the iron stair. Holmes moved about the room with noiseless certainty, like a priest among relics. At last he paused before the pedestal, his long fingers resting lightly upon the brass rail. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "what you behold here is more than a beacon. It is an instrument. Within this lantern lies the secret that Merrick stumbled upon, and it is here we must look if we would hear the voice that summoned his fate." He produced from his pocket the small pivoted plate of blackened tin we had found the previous night. Holding it up, he let the lamplight glance off its edge so that it winked like a malicious eye. One such device may flicker a signal unseen by any save those who know to watch, but Merrick, diligent and suspicious, discovered it. He wrote of an eclipse, and his hand faltered when death pressed upon him. Holmes knelt and examined the base of the lamp. With a swift gesture, he drew forth a thin tool from his pocket case and probed beneath the housing. A faint click answered, followed by the release of a concealed panel. From within, he extracted a length of cord wound about a pulley, its end stained with oil. Attached to it was a cluster of small shutters, cunningly contrived to spring across the lens when the cord was tugged from below. "Observe," he murmured. "Here is no haphazard contrivance, but an engineered mechanism, placed with skill and hidden with art. From the service room below, a man might draw this cord and command the light to wink as obediently as a signalman's lamp. The keeper above would notice only a passing shadow, unless he searched with exact care." Lestrade bent low, his eyes widening despite himself. "By the Lord! And this was set in the government's own lantern." Holmes's expression grew graver still. "Set by hands that had access, or bribed such as had. This is no work of a midnight intruder. It required hours of placement and knowledge of the lantern's heart. The plot runs deeper than a band of shore wreckers. Here is collusion with those entrusted to safeguard the coast." Gryce muttered an oath beneath his breath, his ruddy face paling. "Then Merrick found it and paid the price." Holmes nodded. He may have pulled the cord by chance or spied the shutters at work. His conscience compelled him to act, but his voice was silenced before it could reach the board. Murder cloaked as suicide, and all to preserve the machinery of deceit. He straightened and replaced the panel with meticulous care. The beam swept on, innocent in its grandeur, yet now to me it seemed a treacherous accomplice, capable of both salvation and ruin. I thought of the sailors who steered by its glow, trusting their very lives to its constancy, and shuddered at the thought of it speaking with a false tongue. Holmes, however, was far from finished. He crossed to the narrow stair that wound downward and beckoned us to follow. In the service room below, where the oil tins stood and the trimming tools lay, he pointed to a loop of cord half hidden behind a stack of rags. With a deft pull, he drew it taut, and above us we heard the faint scrape of metal shutters. He released it, and the sound ceased. "There," he said quietly. "The hand that pulled this cord directed ships to their doom." Merrick, perhaps suspecting, left a trace of ash upon the grate where a signal candle burned, and sand upon his sill where a Confederate leaned. For his honesty, he was struck down by a weapon more silent than any pistol. "Silent," I repeated. Holmes's gaze met mine, cold and unwavering. "Yes, Watson. Recall the wound, narrow, puncturing, without powder stain. A bolt, perhaps, driven from a spring or crossbow contrivance, smuggled up these very stairs. Quick, quiet, leaving behind a revolver to complete the illusion. A man intent on false beacons would carry such a weapon. Merrick never fired that pistol. It was placed to still suspicion." The chamber seemed to close about us, its walls echoing with the weight of revelation. Lestrade swore softly. Gryce wiped his brow, and I felt the stirrings of dread at the vastness of what lay hidden beneath these stones. Holmes spoke again, his tone now like steel drawn from its sheath. "Gentlemen, we stand not against common smugglers, but against a conspiracy that uses the very beacon of England as its tool. Ships can be lured, cargo transferred, fortunes built upon ruin, and should an enemy nation choose to exploit such channels, what then? A light turned false could betray a fleet. For a moment, none of us spoke. The hum of the machinery and the sigh of the sea were the only sounds. Then Lestrade drew himself up, his skepticism broken by the sheer weight of proof. "You have them, Holmes. By heaven, you have them, but how do we drag them into the open?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that cold fire I had seen on many a night when the chase was near its height. "By baiting them with their own signal. Tonight we shall give answer to the shadows beyond the horizon, but on our terms. Let them believe the light still serves their commerce. They will come closer, emboldened. Then we shall strike." He replaced the cord carefully, leaving every sign as though untouched. We descended at last into the raw night air. The drizzle had ceased, but the fog clung thicker than before, muffling every sound save the boom of the surf. As we walked back toward the town, Holmes's figure seemed more than ever like that of a sentinel himself, tall and lean, striding through mist with purpose none could shake. He paused once, looking back toward the tower, its beam sweeping solemnly across the night. "The lantern's secret is unmasked," he said softly. "Now we must unmask the men who dare to make it speak falsehood, and when they come for their signal, we shall be waiting." The fog closed in once more, the harbor lamps gleaming dimly through its folds. Yet beneath its veil I felt the stir of approaching conflict, as though the very sea itself held its breath for what must follow. The day wore itself out beneath a sky the color of tarnished pewter, and when darkness returned, it came down like a curtain whose folds the wind could not stir. The town's lamps shivered in their glass cups, and the lighthouse's beam resumed its patient ministry, sweeping the fog with the regularity of a pendulum. Holmes had set his pieces with the exactitude of a chess master. Lestrade's men lay in twos along the turf above the notch and upon the back path to the Widow's Hollow. Sergeant Pritchard, whom Holmes trusted for his blunt honesty, watched from the shadow of the tar sheds. Inspector Gryce held the key with a handful of constables and a lantern hooded to a chink. As for ourselves, we stood once more in the lantern room, the glass breathing against our cheeks and the flame's heart beating in its brass cage. Holmes had restored the treacherous shutters and the cord that commanded them, but his hand hovered above the spring with a restraint I knew cost him an inward effort. "We must mimic their grammar," he said. "No more, no less. A single syllable too bold, and we startle the quarry. Watson, keep your eyes upon the notch. Lestrade, count the intervals aloud in a whisper. If you see the answering flame, give me the word." The minutes that followed were of a quality time seldom attains, stretched thin as wire and taut as a bowstring. The sea spoke in 1,000 small tongues against the rocks. The great lens muttered its secret music. My own breath seemed a trespass in that high chamber. Then, all at once, the faintest prickle of light breathed from the notch, low to the water, there and gone like the wink of a sleeper. "One," Lestrade whispered. Holmes's thumb drew the spring. The beam blinked, recovered, blinked again, once, twice, then held. The answering point replied in kind, a nervous pupil repeating its lesson. Farther out, so far that at first I mistook it for a star imprisoned in vapor, another pallid gleam stirred and began to creep. It was not a star. It rose, sank, and rose again with the pulse of a hull-meeting swell. "They are coming in," Holmes murmured, "and bold, too. Do you see how the outer light translates the inner? One ashore speaks to one afloat, and between them a pathway opens like a lie told, in two voices." He let the spring flick twice more at the appointed rhythm and then removed his hand altogether, trusting to the true beam to play its ancient part. "They expect 3 blinks and a dark hold," he said. "They have had 2. They will lean nearer, peering under the cliff to see if their partner stands firm. That is the moment." We left the lantern to its vigil and descended, swift and silent, the stair booming beneath our feet like a muted drum. Outside, the fog lapped at us with cold breath. Our boots struck the causeway with a damp thud. Holmes drew me aside into the lee of the stone, and for a time we were only two darker shadows within the night. Then came the softest of sounds from below the headland, the dry lick and hush of oars feathered by practiced hands. Holmes's fingers brushed my sleeve, a signal of readiness, and we moved. The causeway ended in a tumble of great stones where the path fell away toward the notch. There Lestrade and his nearest men crouched, their faces small pale ovals under the brims of their hats, their truncheons and pistols held low. Holmes sank to one knee and peered round the rock's shoulder. I followed, and what I saw fixed itself upon my mind with that indelible precision that belongs to moments of peril. A boat lay under the cliff with its bow to the notch, a long, lean craft built more for speed than for burden. Two men pulled at the oars with that noiseless swing I had heard and doubted. A third stood in the stern, a lantern muffled in his cloak. On the ledge above him, scarcely 10 feet higher, a fourth figure was poised in a dark greatcoat, one gloved hand shielding a shuttered lamp, the other lifted as if to command the sea itself to halt and go by turns. The lamp's shutter slid back the width of a coin and closed again. Once, twice. Our echoes returned to us from the stone. Holmes's hand brushed Lestrade's wrist. No shout. No rush. He merely pointed, first to the man on the ledge, then to a thicket of gorse on the turf above the notch where another shadow crouched, as still as if it had grown there. That second watcher was inland upon the path that led toward the widow's hollow. A relay then, shore to ledge, ledge to sea, and behind it all a mind that placed each piece where the law would least expect it. The boat nosed inward. In the stern, the cloaked man lifted his lantern high and held it steady for the count of 3, an answering phrase. The figure on the ledge turned, and in that slight shift, the lamplight, however strangled, struck the brim of his hat and the lower plane of his cheek. I saw the profile as if etched in steel, a sharp nose, a narrow mouth, the jaw of a man whose economy of speech extended to his compassion. Then the light slid back beneath the shutter, and he was darkness again. Holmes's breath touched my ear. That is the heel that bit twice at the widow's gate. You know him? I know his shoe, he returned, and the stride we read upon the sand. Hush. All hung upon the next seconds. The boatmen rested on their oars. A coil of line slid like a black snake across the water. A shape bumped against the boat's flank. A cask, perhaps, or a crate. The covering reeds tied cleverly to mimic a raft of weed. The man in the stern bent to it with the tenderness of a nurse, and his cloak slipped an inch from his shoulder. The oarsman glanced up, and in that instant, Holmes rose. Now, he said, not loud, but with a resonance that travelled like a spark along a fuse. Lestrade's whistle cut the night with a shrill that tore the fog. From the turf above the notch, 2 constables sprang and pinned the inland watcher where he crouched. From the shadows at our level, men surged forward with ropes and cuds. Down on the water, the boat lurched as the oarsmen snatched for their muffled pistols. A shout in a foreign tongue cracked the hush. The stern lantern went out. The line to the crate went slack. Holmes was in motion before any of us, leaping from boulder to boulder with that lithe, precise energy that astonishes until one recollects how his mind runs. He gained the ledge in 3 bounds. The figure there wheeled to meet him with something that flashed in his hand. It was not a knife. The stiff arm, the rigid wrist, told me the weapon before I heard its whisper. A spring bow, compact as a folded trap, fitted with a bolt no longer than a man's palm. "Down, Holmes!" I cried, but the bolt had already flown, a blur, a hiss, a thud against stone where his shoulder had been. Holmes was upon the man in the same breath, and the two went to ground in a welter of cloak and struggling limbs. The shuttered lamp spun, spat a thin thread of light, and guttered. Below, Lestrade's men swarmed the boat like beetles upon a floating log. One oarsman broke for the notch, slipped, vanished, and did not rise. The other flung himself backward and produced a pistol from beneath his belt. I saw the growing circle of its muzzle and felt that curious coolness that sometimes comes to a man in battle, as if his thoughts had distanced themselves from his blood. Before the shot sounded, Sergeant Pritchard struck from the side with the butt of his own pistol, and the weapon went wide, its report swallowed by fog and surf. The stern man jammed an oar between two rocks and tried to lever the boat free. The crate, half caught, knocked and bobbed, its reeds peeling away to show a corner of stenciled board and the dull gleam of tin within. Holmes and his adversary fought in silence save for the rasp of breath and the scrape of boots upon stone. The man fought like one who had been schooled to it. No flourishes, no rage, only those exact, economical movements by which a man preserves his wind and cuts his enemies by degrees. Twice his hand searched for the spring bow where it had fallen. Twice Holmes denied it him with a shift of his weight and a prisoning of the wrist that would have made a wrestler proud. At last the man attempted a new expedient. He went limp, as if yielding. Holmes's grip altered, and in that fraction the fellow twisted like a fish and was up, darting along the ledge with a speed that gained him a yard, then two. Lestrade had seen the turn and scrambled to head him off from the lower rocks, but the way along the upper turf was momentarily free. The fugitive took it, not toward the town as I had thought, but down the narrow back path that lost itself among the gorse toward the widow's hollow. For an instant the thought chilled me with a savage clarity. The man would seek a hostage, a door between us and justice. Holmes was after him like a greyhound from the slip. I, slower, followed with what speed I could, while behind us Lestrade barked orders that scattered his men along the cliff and the causeway both. The path showed itself only as a paler thread in the fog, bounded by prickle and black thorn. It dipped, rose, and slanted treacherously where the turf, sodden with spray, gave beneath the boot. Twice I stumbled. Twice the brambles took my sleeve and left their signatures in my cloth. Ahead, I heard the whisper of feet, the short, controlled breaths of two men running hard. We came upon the hollow like men bursting into a room. The widow's cottage crouched in its shelter, a square of black against a greyer sky. No light showed at the window. The garden shells gleamed dully like bones. The gate stood ajar, and upon the threshold a figure paused. Not Holmes, but the fugitive, his hand extended for the latch. He looked back once, and the lamplight from our lantern behind glanced upon his cheek. "I know you," I said, though no part of my mind had leisure to search a ledger of faces. The double bite at the heel, the narrow shoe, the quick stride. I knew him as one knows a word one has read in darkness and meets again entire in the day. I had seen him pass the tar sheds on our first evening, a clerkly fellow with a ledger under his arm and a hat pressed low against the wet. One Silas Vane, shipping agent to the chandlery beyond the market, and a man no talker in the tavern ever named with heat. Holmes had no need of names. He needed only to interpose his body between that hand and the latch, and he did so with a movement so spare and exact that it seemed inevitable, as if the world had arranged itself to place him there. Vane's mouth set in a line that was not contempt and not fear, merely resolve ground down to its last quotient. His left hand came up from his coat with a flash of steel. I saw not a pistol's round mouth, but the narrow tongue of a blade meant for thrusting, not for show. What followed belongs to those moments when a man's training speaks in a language the mind only translates afterward. Holmes did not leap back, nor did he close headlong. He moved half aside, letting the thrust lengthen past him by a hair's breadth, and his right hand closed upon the attacker's wrist, with a grip that stopped the blade an inch from his ribs. His left hand, open and palm down, slid under the man's elbow and pressed. There was a brittle pop, a cry that was not loud, and the knife fell into the shells with a little lover's clink. Vane sagged, and Holmes bore him to the ground with a care that looked like mercy, and was in truth the most economical path to mastery. "Enough," Holmes said, and the word held no triumph. "We have done with your hands. It is your tongue we require now." Vane's answer was a breath between clenched teeth and a twist of his mouth that might have been a smile had it found the strength. "You require," he said, each syllable clipped, "what the sea has taught me not to give." Lestrade arrived then with 2 men, their lantern's eye cutting a yellow ellipse across the cottage door. He saw the knife, the sprung wrist, the thin, resolute face, and he let out a breath that had been waiting in him for an hour. "By the devil, we have you, my lad." He nodded to the constables. "Bind him." Holmes rose and stepped back, but his gaze had gone past Vane to the door, which had opened the breadth of a hand. In that narrow gap, a pale face hovered, the widow's eyes wide, lips parted, one hand to her throat as if to hold silence in. Holmes bowed to her, very slightly, and the door moved again, closing with the softness of one who has seen enough and trusts what will follow. We brought Vane to his feet and bore him up the path, the lantern weaving its narrow tongue of light over gorse and stone. Behind us, the sea gave a long, exhausted sigh, as if an old plot had come to a pause between acts. Down by the notch, men shouted and answered. The crate was hauled to the ledge, its reeds dripping. Grice's lanterns bobbed upon the quay, and somewhere a bell clanged dissonantly, half alarm, half jubilation. At the head of the path, Vane stumbled, recovered, and turned his face to Holmes. "You think you've stopped it?" he said, very quietly, and there was something in the way he shaped the pronoun that made it broader than one man's pride. "You've cut a cord in a single tower. The sea is a long coast, Mr. Holmes. Lights blink where you are not." Holmes's reply was equally soft. "The sea is long, Mr. Vane, but a web announces itself by the tremor of a single strand. To pluck one is to learn how the others are stretched." Vane's eyes, dark and undocile, shifted once, toward the harbor, toward the tar sheds where the crate had waited, then farther, to the east where the fog lay thickest. In that glance lived an address, a name he would not speak. Holmes did not follow it with his eyes, but I saw that he read it as surely as I. We gained the inn-yard where Lestrade had set a table beneath the eaves. There Vane was secured and seated, his injured arm bound with the rough skill of men who have dealt with worse at sea. The crate, pried open, yielded its heart. Not brandy, not silk, but tins bearing a foreign mark and packed in sawdust thick as chaff. Holmes lifted one with the caution of a man who expects a sting. When he turned it, the stenciling showed itself in clearer characters, the same hand as upon the boards near the tar sheds. "Oil," he said, "but not for lamps. This is a distillate more volatile than kerosene, useful for engines, useful for flame. And here—" He scooped a smaller parcel from the sawdust, light as a bird in his hand. Inside lay the little shutters by the dozen, cut and sprung to pattern. "A franchise," he added, and the word made Lestrade blink. "Supplies for other lights which might be taught to speak the same false language. Your warehouseman was not over-scrupulous, Inspector. He was a node in a chain." Vane laughed then, not merrily. "Chain, web. Take your metaphor and hang a man by it. You know the word, but not the names." Holmes's face was very still. "Names are the last veil. We shall lift it. You have done enough this night to put a rope within the law's reach of your throat. Speak, and you may yet look at the sea in 10 years' time. Keep silence, and you will see it through bars until the morning they bring you out to a yard without gulls." Vane turned his face away, jaw set, a muscle twitching like a tug at anchor. He said nothing. The rain began again, soft as breath, turning the inn-yard to a sheet of mica. Lestrade gave the order to take the prisoner within and post men at every door. Pritchard, His cap clamped low, stamped the cold from his feet, and cast an eye toward the lighthouse, where the beam went on, indifferent to commerce and crime alike. Holmes till then had stood with his head bent and his hands deep in his pockets, the outline of his profile cut clean against the lamplight. Now he straightened, and his gaze traveled once more to the east, where the fog-wrapped horizon had swallowed that distant, creeping star. "Watson," he said lightly, as if we were to stroll to Simpson's for supper, "we have taken a hand that holds a shutter and a boat that carries tins. Tomorrow we must ask after the purse that pays for both. It will not be found in Seaforth's taverns." I felt the fatigue of action upon me. That pleasant heaviness that comes after fear has done its work and left only the body to confess it. Yet within that weariness another feeling stirred, a sense that the business, far from concluded, had only shifted to a wider stage. The widow's pale face behind her door, Merrick upon his narrow bed, the tin shutters in Holmes's palm, all these were beads upon a string whose end vanished into the fog. We stood a minute longer under the eaves, listening to the rain thread the darkness. Then Holmes looked at me sidewise, and there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Do you observe, my dear fellow," he said, "how often the sea teaches a man to translate distance into danger? Shadows beyond, the horizon, you called them. Tomorrow we shall see who casts them, and from what shore." The morning that followed our capture of Silas Vane broke clear and hard, the fog swept away by a brisk wind from the east. The sea, no longer muffled, revealed itself in merciless brilliance, every wave cresting with the whiteness of broken glass. The town, shaken from its uneasy slumber, bustled with rumor. Some swore a gang of wreckers had been taken red-handed, others whispered of foreign agents whose signals had lured not only merchant craft, but perhaps warships into peril. Yet amidst the clamor, the widow's cottage remained still, its garden shells pale in the sun, its door shut upon grief. Holmes rose early and had already been to the Lighthouse before I joined him. He returned to our rooms at the Harbour Inn with his lean face set in lines of quiet resolution. In his hand, he carried the logbook of Colin Merrick. It was found tucked beneath the mattress, he explained, laying it gently upon the table. Gryce overlooked it in his zeal. "Read, Watson." I opened the book, its pages stiff with salt air and ink blotched by a hand no longer steady. The final entries, written in Merrick's cramped script, recorded not merely the eclipse of the lens, but his own misgivings. "I have seen the light wink when no cloud crossed it. I fear the lamp is not my own. If it is betrayed, then I am the traitor's accomplice. I cannot bear it. Should aught befall me, let it be known I stood my post faithful." I looked up, the words blurring before my eyes. His last act was not despair, Holmes, but testimony. He left this as his defense. Holmes inclined his head gravely. The revolver was thrust upon him, the wound delivered by another hand, but this is the voice of a man who would not abandon duty even in death. He died striving to shield the truth until help could reach it. His last duty was to guard the light from corruption. Lestrade entered then, his brisk tread softened by the weight of what he bore. We have the prisoner safe in jail, though he has given us nothing but silence. As for the crate, the experts confirm your suspicion. The tins hold a volatile oil, and the shutters are fashioned to fit lanterns across the coast. If this trade is not checked, half the beacons of England may one day wink false. Holmes received the news without triumph. Then it is as I feared. Merrick stumbled upon a design larger than one tower. Vane was but a clerk, a broker of shadows. The purse that filled his hand lies elsewhere, perhaps across the Channel, perhaps in London itself. That investigation belongs now to the Yard and to the Admiralty. For us, Watson, the circle closes here. We went together to the widow's cottage. She received us with composure, though her eyes were hollowed by vigil. Holmes placed the logbook upon the table before her. "Madam," he said gently, Your husband was no suicide. He discovered a plot against his trust, and for that discovery he was slain. Yet he left words to prove his faithfulness. His honor is unblemished." She pressed the book to her breast, her hands trembling at last. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew he would never turn the light against his calling. God bless you for bringing me this." Holmes bowed his head, and for once he did not speak. There are silences which even he would not trespass. That evening, as the sun went down in splendor, the lighthouse stood sentinel once more, its great beams sweeping the horizon with renewed constancy. The false shutters had been removed, the cord destroyed, and the lantern shone with a purity that seemed almost defiant. Upon the quay, townsfolk gathered to watch, their faces solemn. They did not cheer, for they understood too well the price paid for that steadfast light. Holmes and I stood apart, the sea wind tugging at our coats. Lestrade approached, his manner subdued. "There will be commendations, no doubt," he said, "though the name most deserving will never stand upon the roll. Merrick died as true a servant of the crown as any man could." Holmes answered quietly, "Truth has no need of commendation, Lestrade. It is its own epitaph." As darkness deepened and the beam strode out into the night, I thought of Merrick's solitary vigil, of his faltering hand recording an eclipse that was no work of nature, of his final courage in leaving behind the testament that cleared his name. He had not lived to see justice, but justice had claimed him nonetheless. Holmes lit his pipe, the flame flickering briefly before the wind carried it away. He exhaled a long plume of smoke that vanished into the salt air. "The sea, Watson," he said, "is like truth, vast, treacherous, merciless, yet within its tumult there is constancy. Merrick held to it until the end. That is his victory." We turned from the harbor then, leaving behind the gathered townsfolk, the steadfast widow, the captured conspirator, and the eternal hymn of the waves. The case of the lighthouse chamber was closed, yet its shadows stretched far beyond Seaforth, into courts and councils we would never see. For us, it remained a memory etched in salt and flame, another chapter in the chronicles of Baker Street. And so the beam of Seaforth light swept on, untarnished, uncorrupted, faithful once more, an everlasting witness to the keeper's last duty.